that transform the way leaders and their organizations think and behave. He's also presented at TEDx Gramercy about the power of games and how they can drive behavioral change in business. Let's extend a warm welcome as I pass the mic to the Senior Vice President of Corporate Solutions at the Neuroleadership Institute, Marshall Bergman. Great to have you here, Marshall. I'm passing it over to you.
Thanks, Evan. Thanks for the wonderful introductions. And thank you, Jeff and Drew, for joining us today. And thank you, the entire audience, for being here for what should be a really interesting conversation. I'm looking forward to it today. And the agenda for today is pretty straightforward. We're going to be covering a lot of questions that we often get from clients, prospective clients, or people who are just interested in the work that NLI does, and really dig down into what is some of the underlying principles, concepts, best practices, and research that can help you transform your organization in weeks, not years. So I think what I'll start with is I'll just start really with who NLI is and what our mission and our vision are. And I think that will then lead into some really interesting conversations. And what's going to be great about today's conversation is I think each of our panelists here today have a different perspective on the sorts of conversations that we have with clients and the sorts of conversations that you're having with leaders within your organization as you consider transforming your organizations and changing behavior. So Drew really lives, so I'll start with myself first. So where I really live is, in the sales team and on the leadership team, having those initial conversations with clients to help understand their business challenges, and then translating those into behavior change solutions that are going to help them achieve their strategic goals. Drew and his team and client experience really come in once the overall strategy is decided to actually implement the change. So I'll be honest, the work Drew does is a lot harder than the work I do, because it's really the blocking and tackling of getting human beings to change their behavior on a daily basis. And so Drew will be able to share insights about what he's encountering, best practices there. And then Jeff, as one of our top facilitators, is really there in the classroom with learners and participants every day. And he can share how they're reacting to the content, how they're reacting to the way that we focus on driving behavior change. What are those aha moments they're experiencing? And how can you take what he experiences in the classroom or the virtual classroom and translate that to the work that you do? So those are kind of the three areas that each of us will dig into. And as I go through each chapter of the presentation, I'll definitely pause for questions. We'll also be monitoring the chat and actively scanning that for questions and answers as well. So why don't we get started, like I said, where we begin. So at NLI, our vision is to make organizations more human through science. And our mission is to identify and implement habit activation strategies that affect change in weeks, not years. Now, let's dig into that, make organizations more human through science first. When NLI was founded 25 years ago, the whole study of neuroscience and understanding the brain and biology and how that impacts behavior was somewhat at its infancy. And so David and Lisa Rock, our founders, started to take some of that research from the lab and start to figure out, what does that lab research mean to people in organizations, leaders in organizations who are trying to get their organizations, their teams, their people aligned behind strategies and behave in specific ways in order to achieve success. And so when we think about making organizations more human through science, the first place that we start when we're trying to solve a problem is, what does the research say? So we've got a team of neuroscientists, we've got a network of hundreds of scientists across the globe at various labs that are constantly pumping out really interesting insights about human behavior and biology. But it's really hard sometimes to take what someone took from the lab and translate that into something that's useful for a real human being who's very busy every day at work, reading hundreds of emails, trying to corral people and get them to achieve their goals, et cetera, et cetera. So what we've been able to do at NLI is really consolidate that science into specific habits that regular human beings can practice over time in order to change their behavior. And that could be something like, how do I give feedback in an effective manner? How do I mitigate bias? How do I act more inclusively in my organization? How do I create a culture where people are comfortable and have the psychological safety to speak up when they see something going wrong? Or how do I have a growth mindset so that I can see change as a challenge, not a threat? Those are all the sorts of problems that I'm having, conversations I'm having every day with leaders and organizations. And what they're looking for are, what are the few things that I could tell my people to do every day that are going to allow them to be better? And so the next piece of that, and that mission thing, is how can we affect change in weeks, not years? And this is something that we've actually been working really hard at. And if you think about the last couple of years with COVID, what our research shows, and what many of the other major consulting firms research shows, is those organizations that were able to change quickly, rapidly, and effectively were more effective and were able to weather the storm of COVID and the underlying challenges that we face in the business world more effectively, because they were able to change quickly. And so what we found is that if organizations can build talent capabilities that allow people to change quickly, they can be more successful, they can be more resilient, and they can actually drive higher levels of revenues, profitability, operational efficiencies, et cetera. And so one of the things that we've been focused on is not just what are the behaviors that people need, but how can we change 100,000 people in 30 days? And that's ultimately our goal, because in the world that we live in right now, sometimes you need to change that fast. And Drew is going to share some great examples around that. So that's our vision and that's our mission. And so what I wanted to talk about a little bit, and then we'll get into, we got some Severance references here. Is that the book, the show? Yes, I've been watching that crazily. So yeah, Drew, I didn't know you were a fan, so we'll have to talk about that. I said I was watching the chat here. So anyway, so let's talk a little bit about let's talk about real practically about what some of this looking at the research to make organizations more human and changing behavior at scale mean. So I'd say, let's go back to 2008. NLI became aware of some research around the concept of social threat and reward. For those who aren't aware, you can take a look at any of our articles around our SCARF model. But fundamentally, one of the operating principles of our brain is that our human beings are social animals. We're constantly scanning our environment for threat. Our brain has much higher threat responses than reward responses because it wants to keep us alive. And because of that, sometimes people act a lot differently when you say certain things to them about changing or about feedback than you might expect, because they immediately go into a threat state. So that was one of the first pieces of research. And funny fact, if you Google SCARF, you actually find more references on the web to SCARF than you'd see to Maslow's hierarchy. So it's become a real popular model, and it's become really popular because it helps people understand a fundamental behavior of human beings, which is we run away from threat and we move towards reward. And so that research turned into a SCARF model, and then that turned into, you may have read our article, Throw Away Your Performance Ratings or Kill Your Performance Ratings in 2014, which really transformed the way organizations think about performance feedback. Again, going back to that concept of threat and reward, performance feedback. I don't know if anyone's had a performance feedback conversation recently, but I know when I have those, I don't sleep well the night before. I'm all preparing myself because I know I'm going to hear things I don't like to hear, et cetera. And in fact, even when I'm giving performance reviews, I don't sleep well because it's hard to give feedback to people. So having that fundamental understanding that the way organizations had been doing performance reviews over the last 20, 30, 40 years wasn't working, and it wasn't based on human biology, is that perfect example of how we make organizations more human by following the science. Then let me just tell you about the next step. So how do we build those capabilities at scale? We have programs that teach people things like the SCARF model and how to use it to give better feedback, how to use it to be more inclusive. And one of our programs, Connect, has been rolled out to over 200 different organizations. And we get 97% of people who've been through the Connect program report they are more effective in their day-to-day work. So that's the story of understanding the research, understanding making organizations more human through science, and then changing behavior at scale, because we can drive those behaviors through our programs. I'll do a quick, why don't I do this? Why don't I do a quick pause here? Actually, you know what I'll do? Let me just do a couple quick other examples, and then we'll get into some of the meat here. So other areas that we've sort of driven change in talent in organizations would be diversity, equity, and inclusion. In 2013, we realized that bias awareness programs weren't working. So we went back to the research. We identified that bias is an unconscious process. Just teaching people about biases doesn't allow them to fix their biases. And so if you're going to stop something that's unconscious, you need to do a few things. You need to give people a language, define each of those biases, give them a way to talk about them in a non-threatening way, and then give them mitigation strategies for the different types of biases. Again, that became our bias mitigation program called Decide. It's been delivered to over 300 global companies, over 1 million participants, and 78% of those participants mitigate biases 1 to 3 times per week. So real results, real change in organizations at scale. And last but not least, talk a little bit about growth mindset. Back in 2016, we published an article called Organizational Growth Mindset, which built on Carol Dweck's work. That work has been used by organizations from Microsoft to Hewlett Packard to Procter & Gamble to help make their organizations more resilient so they can see change as a challenge, not a threat. And again, that research taken from the lab, creating real specific habits that human beings can practice every day, and then rolled out through teams like Drew and Jeff to hundreds and thousands of people at a time, have allowed organizations to be much more resilient, much more adaptable to change, and much more effective in responding to all of the changes that we're facing right now. So that is sort of why NLI exists, how we take the science, apply that science to make organizations more human, and then drive behavior change at scale. So what I was thinking about talking, and the work goes on now. We're next programs and new research we're doing is around psychological safety. We've done work on how to reduce conflict in organizations. We've done research on voice and allyship. So we continue to plumb the depths of human behavior and try to find ways to solve those problems. So Drew, any examples of any experience you've had with clients around any of those particular topic areas or solutions that might be worth sharing with the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Marshall. So, I mean, right now, what we've been seeing a lot of is, psychological safety is big, especially when we're looking in terms of, what maybe flexible or hybrid workspace looks like for our clients, right? A lot of organizations are currently struggling this as we start to head back into the office, or we're still working virtually, or it's a mix of both, right? So managers are kind of in this weird situation where it's like, how do I best effectively manage? And right now, I'm actually working with it's the GROW program, and this is what Marshall referenced in terms of growth mindset. We're rolling out enterprise-wide at a global security and aerospace company. There's a headcount of over 115,000 employees. They operate globally. And when we always begin to partner with organizations, right, we really want to understand what they want to achieve, right? In this particular client's mindset, right, it's we need to perpetually innovate because if we don't, our newest line of products is going to be obsolete within 6 months, 12 months, whatever it might be. So they kind of went through the growth mindset with a dual focus, right? So they wanted to encourage a growth mindset to create environments where feedback occurs a little more regularly. They were struggling with feedback. They'd send products to market that basically weren't as strong as they could have been, or they didn't get off the line because the proper feedback channels weren't there. They also wanted to create a common language around growth mindset and really make it common practice by making it pragmatic and very easy to apply for anyone at the organization. And part of that folds into the psychological safety, right? So one of the key components of experimentation with growth mindset is really creating a very psychologically safe environment. Because if you're going out on a limb to come up with the next brand new product or service, whatever it might be, if that's not successful immediately, then you might get your hand slapped and you might be very resistant to innovating the next time around, right? So what they did, they're trying to embed the psychological safety component into their culture. So we went through the GROW program, and we've noticed that when we pulled out over 300 or so folks, we saw that 85% of them within 3 weeks of going through the program have shifted or noticed themselves in a fixed mindset moment and shifted to a growth mindset. And I think one of the most telling components was 92% of them reported out that they were sharing mistakes and learnings with a team member. So this is kind of that fail forward or failed fast type approach. Additionally, 95% also reported discussing growth mindset with a colleague, right? So this ties back to their goal and their objective of creating a common language. So there's a lot of good ways that our clients have been applying the concepts of neuroscience as well as the growth mindset to really make it practical for any member of their employee workforce, whether it's on a manufacturing floor, whether or not it's virtual in front of a computer, or maybe it could be potentially in the Pentagon, right? So we're unclear where all those folks filter in, but the key concept is that they're leveraging growth mindset to drive positive organizational change.
Thanks, Drew. That's a great example. Yeah, just to recap a couple of numbers. So we're talking enterprise-wide, over 100,000 employees. We're talking change in several months, not several years. And a couple of things that I'll share about that is that should be your goal as an organization. It is achievable to get all of your organization to change. What we're trying to encourage folks to think about is a mindset shift, whereas in the past, people would think, all right, we can maybe reach 2,000 leaders, and we hope that those leaders will trickle down the learning. What we would encourage, and what the research shows, is if you do a many-to-many program where everyone is learning the same simple habits at the same time, you will get a virtuous cycle effect where the more people learn the habits, the more people see other people practicing the habits, the more likely they are to practice those habits, as opposed to just focusing on top leaders or just focusing on certain parts of the organization. So, and one of the ways that we do that, and Jeff, I'm going to come to you in a second, so be ready, is by focusing on very specific things that every employee can do. So what Drew was talking a little bit about was habits. So every time we focus on changing behavior, we focus on the essential habits that people should practice every day to get the results they're looking for. And Jeff, is in the classroom, the virtual classroom, on the webinars every day, teaching those 3 essential habits for the GROW program, or the 3 essential habits for DECIDE, whatever they are. So Jeff, why don't you talk a little bit about how people react to that and how they can sort of leverage those habits so quickly to start changing behavior?
Yeah, thank you very much, Marshall. So some of you, of course, are NLI clients here, so you probably know this really, really well. But for those of you who are brand new, one of the ways that we deliver our programs is through what we call a hive. And we have people show up for a particular program. It could be Include, it could be Decide, it could be Grow, some of our other programs. And we have a cohort of individuals go through 3 different modules. Typically, we introduce some science in the very beginning, in that very first module, and introduce one of the habits. Then they finish that particular webinar, and then they use certain practice tools. So we might have guides and certain practice tools. We give them a research summary, and then they go back to their offices, interact with their colleagues, engage in certain homework assignments, talk to one another, apply the information, digest it, come back, and then do the same thing again with another habit. And so as the process continues through the 3rd habit, the more they start to act on this information, the more it becomes widespread throughout the organization, the more they have conversations around it, the more they actualize the behavior, the more permanent the more permanent it becomes in terms of part of what they do. And it becomes natural for them to have the conversations and the dialogue. And it really does help for people to kind of go through this together. And it also helps to have what we will sometimes call accountability partners, if you will, meaning we, as a facilitator, I will often say this, and I apologize to those of you who maybe heard me say this at some point: information is not transformation, right? Very often people will show up at a webinar and gain some information, some insights, but then they won't do anything with it. And so therefore, these hives and the way we set up our programs are designed to encourage people to actually engage in those behaviors. That's creating more neural connections, making those connections deeper, and making those long-lasting habits that will ensure that transformation and that will last in the organization.
That's great, Jeff. And I think I saw a question here. So what's an example of a daily habit? Well, that's a great question, Julia. So I will give you an example, but since we're focused on GROW, I'll share with you the 3 habits from our GROW program, which would be experiment, value progress, and learn from others. So if we're taking a look at the GROW program and Jeff's talking about that hive, which is essentially, it's almost like a half-day workshop broken up into 3 one-hour sessions, benefit of spacing so that you get more effective processing and practicing of the learning between each session, and also not overwhelming people with 3 things to do instead of 1. So when Jeff is going to teach that habit of experimentation, he's going to teach why it's hard to experiment. So as he mentioned, he's going to talk about the science. Here's the science of why experimentation is hard. It goes back to social threat and reward. We're afraid to fail, right? Then he's going to talk a little bit about how do you experiment? Well, start off with easy experiments. Start off with things that are easier for you as opposed to hard experiments. When it comes to value progress, we teach a skill of the rule of 3s. Where were you 6 months ago? Where are you now? And where will you be 6 months in the future? So these are very practical, easy to remember, recallable habits. And then the practice tools that Jeff's talking about really give you a chance to work on them in the flow of work. And I think that's just one other thing I'd like to highlight for folks is you can get a lot more behavior change done if you focus on a few simple things that you ask people to do and give them really clear, interesting insights and actions to take. And Jeff, I don't know if you have anything to add about the habits there, but I know you live it every day. So go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Marshall. And so Marshall was talking about GROW. I could talk about a number of the other programs. For instance, like Decide. One of the things we talk about, for instance, is finding common ground. And how do we identify what people have in common? Because very often at a non-conscious level, we talk about this in our SEEDS models, another one of our kind of foundational models. We have what we call a similarity bias, which means at a non-conscious level, when we interact with another human being, we're always trying to identify who's part of our in group versus who's part of our out group, friend versus foe. And the tendency is, if we're not aware of it, is to engage in a way with people that treat them as if they are kind of others, and people feel excluded. So we want the opposite. So we say, how do you widen your circle and invite more people in? Well, one of the ways we do that is to find common ground, which means, what do I have in common with another human being that maybe the superficial or maybe even the real differences that we see in one another might indicate otherwise. And so we talk about activities that we can engage in, and human beings get on a webinar like this. And just like you're sharing in the chat right now, they will share activities across an enterprise that help to create common ground. We have icebreakers during some of our meetings. We have happy hours, virtual happy hours these days. All the kind of ways that we can find common ground with another person, building that connectedness with other people, and therefore inviting them into our in-group. So we encourage people to practice those habits every day, during regular interactions with one another, during meetings and so forth, and they become permanent parts of what they do.
Wonderful. Jeff, you're getting popular here on the chat. Everyone wants to keep hearing more from you, so I'm going to have to keep coming back, but keep doing what you're doing. All right, so why don't we, so I think what I'd like to do now is, we were talking a little bit about GROW, we were talking about the habits. So one of the things that we also love to do here at these is, make sure if there's additional information that you'd like from us on any of the things that we're talking about, please type it in the chat. I'll pause right now and just say, if anyone would like to learn more about GROW, if you just go ahead and type GROW in the chat, that's our growth mindset work. Please go ahead, type that in the chat. We'll follow up with you, schedule some time either to chat with someone or send you some information as well. So just go ahead, type in GROW if you think that would be particularly useful. Jeff also mentioned some of our really important work in diversity, equity, inclusion. So there would be another program called Decide, which is our unconscious bias program. So if you're interested in learning more about Decide, you can go ahead and type that in. And I think the last one we covered, Jeff was touching on as well, which was the one around finding common ground, is our Include program. So that's our inclusion program. So if you're interested in that, go ahead and type Include. And then Kate, if you want them all, just go ahead, type them all. We've got people monitoring the chat and they will find all of you. So thank you very much for typing that in. I'm going to shift gears and go back towards Drew a little bit, because there was a really good question in the chat, which is, where should you focus your change management efforts? Should it be at the executive level? Should it be at the manager level? Should it be at the frontline person level? And I'll just give the NLI answer, and then I'll let Drew kind of talk to you about like what it really looks like on the ground. But our perspective and what the research shows is you should actually try to reach as many people as you can at the same time. So again, going back to that concept, one of the most powerful drivers of change that research has shown is thinking that other people are doing something. So for example, if I know that everyone's been through the DECIDE program, and I know and I think that everyone's practicing using the SEEDS model, I'm more likely to do it, as opposed to if I hear, oh, I heard our top 5,000 leaders are going through some unconscious bias program. That doesn't really help me. It doesn't really motivate me. And a great example of that would be there's been some great research on those little notes that you see in the hotels about, getting your towels cleaned. It says like, many of our hotel guests don't choose to have their towels cleaned because it saves, the environment, that sort of thing. It's not about saving the environment that actually matters. It's the fact that they said many of our hotel guests do this. You feel inclined to say, oh, I don't want to be the outlier here. I want to be with the group, right? Going back to Jeff's thing about like being in group, right? So Drew, why don't you talk to us a little bit about, and also please get into some of the challenges, because I know many of our clients are reluctant to try to go after everyone at the same time with the same habits. So why don't you talk a little bit about what that looks like as we implement change initiatives?
Yeah, thanks, Marshall. What you're conveying there is more of an everyone to everyone model, right? So it's not top down driven by executive stakeholders. It's not grassroots from the direct reports pushing all the way up, right? So typically when we partner, we understand what's going to work best from each organization standpoint based on where they're at any given point in time. But additionally, it's also looking holistically at the program itself and exactly which direction we're gonna move them through, right? And some organizations are saying, okay, we need our executives to drive this, or else there's no priority being set and we can't get liftoff, right? So in that case, we leverage the executives or the key stakeholders by creating a what's in it for me, making it very relatable, making it very important, making it a priority for the organization, and then leveraging those habits that both you and Jeff had mentioned before. So the NLI habits, whether it's grow, whether it's include, whether we're creating a custom set of habits for these organizations, we then build out the WIFM not only for the executives to push this through, but also through the next tiers of management and the direct reports, right? So we are creating value for every single piece of participant population throughout the organization. The reason we're doing this is because these things have to matter to everyone individually, especially now. Today's leaders, many of you on the line right now, you're very, very busy, right? And on top of that, it might just be another priority that changes in the wind, right? So what we really look to do is create the key priority, we leverage the NLI habits, and then we drive throughout the organization. On top of that, what we end up seeing there is that when we're asking the managers to have conversations with their teams, we found that this is a very compelling way to also get the word out there, to show that this matters at the organization, to show that it cares, and also get them talking about to their team. So again, it comes back to this common creative language in which these organizations will then use to look at that positive behavior change.
Thanks, Drew. That's really, it's really helpful. A couple of things to touch on. I saw in the chat, it looks like Danny said something that initial buy-in needs to be at the top. So yes, 100%. So I spend a lot of my time, as we talked about, like where each of us live our day to day. I spend a lot of my time working with senior leaders, helping them understand not only how they can change their organization, but getting them to buy into the language, the habits, the fact that everyone should be changing at once. So we spend a lot of time there, and we've got some amazing data too. We did find that if you do have leadership buy-in, you're going to get, I think, Drew, correct me if I'm wrong, like 11% more effective behavior change.
Yep.
Yeah. So yes, so you're 100% right, Danny. You do need to have leader buy-in, and one of the ways that we suggest getting leader buy-in is actually by it, instead of saying, yes, I'm bought in, by actually having them practicing those habits every day. Like ultimately for us, it's more about walking the walk than talking the talk. And that's why we encourage everyone practicing the same things. A lot of people think, oh, my executives need this program on, this flavor, my mid-level managers need this, my frontline folks need this. If everyone's practicing the same most essential habits, you are going to get much higher levels of behavior change. And that's counterintuitive. It's counterintuitive. You always think someone needs something special. And Jeff, maybe I'll go to you a little bit. I know you deliver sometimes to executives, and sometimes you might be delivering to people who are new hires or frontline. Like, does the content work no matter what level you're at? And what do you do to make it work?
Yeah, absolutely. And let me, if I may, Marshall, just to comment on what you were just speaking about, I will have conversations with participants, and it's very interesting because I never know exactly who's going through the training all of the time. And sometimes I work with Drew, and we'll talk about this. And sometimes we start with the leadership, but sometimes we start rank and file employees, and it's really interesting to hear their comments. And so here are a couple of anecdotal comments that I'll hear, but I hear these really regularly. Number one, I wish my manager could be here to hear the message that you're delivering right now, or to learn the language, because I'm afraid that I'm going to go back to work and I'll have the knowledge, have the vocabulary of SCARF or C's or some of the other models we use, and no one else will understand what I'm talking about. And therefore it will not permeate the organization, right? And so it's really important that you and your colleagues go through it together. Leadership clearly has a tremendous disproportionate impact in how the culture is shaped, and therefore it clearly helps, the research shows, to have them on board as well. So to Marshall's point, however, when we deliver these, let's say I deliver with a cohort of leaders, then we will position the content from a leadership perspective. So when you go back to work with your team members, here are the things from a leadership perspective we should really be thinking about, right? We talked about psychological safety earlier with regard to the GROW program. Leaders are clearly a strong driver in creating organizational psychological safety throughout an organization. And so what are you saying to your team members? How are you treating them when they make mistakes, right? We're giving them positive feedback. We're helping them grow from mistakes or failures they make. The way that you interact with them will create that growth mindset. And so know that as a leader. And when we're talking to more rank and file employees, we use the same models. We shift the language a little bit, and we give different kinds of assignments that are more relevant to the kind of work that they actually engage in. How are you communicating with your peers? Where do you share mistakes with them, and those kinds of things? And so regardless of the level, all of the information works. We just shape it, and we have people apply it in a very practical way to what it is that they do.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, super helpful. Yeah, and I think again, that's the key thing. You want to keep everyone focusing on the same habits, but you need to give them the right context for their particular role. And that's really the difference. And I know that Drew does a lot of work there as well. And I think, just to sum up a couple of things that we often hear from clients when we talk to them about this, because it forces you to think differently about how you're going to drive change, or how you're going to train people, or how you're going to do behavior change in an organization. These are some of the traps that you might fall into. And I'll, Drew, feel free to jump in after I share some. So sometimes one of the major traps is people always want to be exhaustive, not essential. So there's always going to be someone in the ecosystem, a leader of a particular team, or someone who thinks that a particular topic is really important. And so we always want to add more on, or add more into the program. And I would just say, try to resist that as much as you can, because the more that you add, the less likely people are to change. Just think about New Year's resolutions. It's a simple, silly example, but you don't make 10 New Year's resolutions, you make one, and you often fail at that one, right? So just think about your folks, as Drew was saying, super busy, lots going on. Should we give them 10 things to work on, or should we give them 3 things to work on? Focus on the things that are not only essential, but easy to recall and easy to do, that are going to have the biggest impact. A great example that I'd like to use is, if you went and Googled, what are the best ways for me to stay healthy? You'd come up with 1,000 different articles that would show how to be healthy. But what if you hired a scientist to spend a year figuring out what are the 3 most important things that will have the biggest impact across everyone in my 100,000 person organization? That researcher would probably say, well, they need to get enough sleep, they need to drink a lot of water, and they need to get half an hour of cardio exercise a day. 3 things that we're going to have the biggest impact on the most people. That's what we're talking about here. Yes, there's 100 other things that people could do, but if you get everyone to be healthier in your organization, if they did those 3 things, that's achievable. And that's what we want to focus on. So we're talking about grow. We're talking about inclusion. When we're talking about mitigating unconscious bias, yes, there are lots of great things to do, but what are the 3 most essential things that everyone can do? That's where you're going to get the biggest lift. And that's how you're going to change in weeks, not years, and hundreds of thousands of people. So Drew, I don't know how you've had those conversations where people are like, but what about this? What about this? How do you manage that?
Yeah, a lot of times I'll hear, we want the SEEDS model, we want the SCARF model, we want to tackle inclusion and growth mindset and psychological safety all at once, right? So a lot of times clients, in their defense, they're looking for the silver bullet, so to speak. And not only that, but then we got to get this all done in a particular time frame, right? And that comes back to being essential versus exhaustive, right? In a lot of cases, less is more. I always go back. When NLI chunks things into 3, as you all notice, one of the things I always recall back on is fire safety, right? If there's a fire, you stop, drop, and roll. That's been drilled into your brain for years and years, ever since you were a child, right? When we create specific learning pathways, or we're rolling out organizationally 2 different levels, right? We're trying to compare or create a compelling case as to why this matters for each particular level. And at the end of the day, it comes back to the stickiness of the habits, right? I see and 911, right? So very, very simple. But in terms of like what we always recommend is the less is more. Make sure that whatever we're out there speaking to or teaching is A, very sticky, B, very relevant, and 3, very pragmatic, right? Because we want them to really understand what they need to be doing differently, and then provide them with the tools to go out and execute on that immediately coming out of that session.
Wonderful. Thanks, Drew. So one of the questions I saw in the chat, which we did spend we covered in great detail last week. So I would definitely have you look up last week's webinar, but how do we measure our change initiatives? And that's actually a really important question. So why don't we dig into that a little bit right now? But just thinking back to what we've been talking about here. So we talked about each of these programs or each of these initiatives have 3 habits. And by the way, we're talking about NLI stuff, but you can apply these practices as well, right? You can identify the 3 most essential habits for your organization, for whatever initiative you're trying to do. But what we would say then is if you want to measure the impact of that initiative, you want to measure how often those people are activating those habits every day. So fundamentally, behavior change is about doing something differently. So do we measure, like, was Jeff's facilitation fantastic, and was he super engaging, and did people get all sorts of insights? Absolutely. And Jeff gets great scores. Don't worry about it. He's amazing. But what we really care about is 2 weeks later or 2 months later, are they practicing those habits that Jeff taught them? How many times per week are they doing that? And so we've got a survey that we built. It's called the Behavior Change Pulse. BCP is the data, is the term that we use. And basically we go out and we ask both participants to self-report, as well as having peers and managers, reporting on each other, saying, how often, Drew, have you practiced the behavior of labeling a bias using the SEEDS model in the past week? And Drew would give a number. I've done that 3 times. I've done that 1 time. I've done that 5 times. And in general, what we tend to get for all of our programs is anywhere between 70 to 90% of participants 2 months after a program practicing those habits 1 to 3 times per week. So for us, that's real behavior change. And if you just do some math, you think, let's say you've got an organization with 10,000 people. Let's say 70% of those, or 7,000, practice the habits of mitigating bias 1 to 3 times per week. And they do that every week for 52 years. I can't do the math, but Jeff, I know you got an MBA. Maybe you can do it faster than me. 7,000 times 52 is a lot of mitigating bias every week, right? So that's a lot. That's a year's worth of biases mitigated, right? So Sonia asks, is the behavior change pulse publicly available? We have written a lot about it. There's a fantastic article in Fast Company magazine that Catherine, who runs our client experience and measurement team, Catherine Milan, wrote with David Rock recently. So you could take a look at that. But yeah, it's definitely a worthwhile way to think about how you're going to change the way that you measure. And Danny's asking, are the surveys anonymous? Yes, I believe they're anonymous. Drew, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, they are, Danny. That's a good question. So they are anonymous. We do not share who the respondents are. Additionally, one of the things, so in terms of behavior change surveying, right? So NLI, our approach is basically put into 3 buckets, all with a goal towards accomplishing behavior change, right? So preparedness, we ask about whether or not the practices and the content or the concepts are becoming easier and naturally automatic for people to use what they've learned. So are they implementing the habits? We look at retention, which is whether or not people retained the information from the programs. And then we look at frequency, right? So is this being used? Where is it being used? And is this where we want people actually using the learning, right? And that all bundles up into the behavior change. So we do survey participants. One of the other things we also do is survey direct reports, right? We do this for 2 reasons. And this is if we're sending managers through a program. But we'll actually survey their direct reports because, hey, I might be a participant of the program and I might be saying, oh, I'm mitigating bias 10 times a day. I'm so great at it. Look at me. But then we go and we measure their direct reports and they're saying, I don't even know what unconscious bias is, right? So it's kind of just that double-edged sword. And then what we also do is we inform the participants that, hey, we're also going to be measuring your direct reports to create a sense of accountability for them to take the program more seriously and or to make sure that they're having the intended discussions with their teams, right? So back to that common language, right? Teach this to your teams, have conversations around it. It's very important.
Thanks, Drew. So I'll give a little question here. If anyone wants to learn more about BCP, because we've been having so much conversation about BCP, feel free to type BCP in the chat and we can reach out and have a conversation around that as well. So we're coming close to the end here. Let me just see, Drew or Jeff, did either of you see any questions come through the chat that you wanted to address or that I haven't had a chance to get to?
I didn't see any questions, Marshall. I did want to speak to the measurement in terms of success from an anecdotal perspective, because I'll leave it to you, Marshall and Drew. You guys know the numbers better than I do. I show up and deliver the programs, and I get reactions from participants as to the success or effectiveness of the work that we engage in. And I'm thinking right now about one particular client. We teach another program called BrainBased Coaching. It's a public course. And a participant came to one of our deliveries. This was a couple of years or so ago before the pandemic. And he liked it so much and found it so effective that he brought us internal to his organization, a large insurance company. So he wanted to teach his entire team because he found benefit in helping people to generate insights and to give feedback and to give coaching and have those challenging performance conversations. And anecdotally, he said, Jeff, I'm using this everywhere and I'm finding it so beneficial. He said, I talked to my son who was about to go to college and he had several schools he was considering. And some of them were really expensive. And had his son gone there, would have cost a tremendous amount of money, more money than they wanted to spend. So he said, I actually used the coaching approach that you taught us to have a conversation about what school he would attend. Typically, I would have said, no, you're not going to this school because it costs too much money. But he said, instead, I coached him and I asked some questions about what he anticipates and expects in terms of paying back loans, et cetera, at the end of that 4 years. And he said his son on his own concluded, I will not go to the more expensive schools. I will go to the less expensive school because, yeah, he came up with his own insight. And this is one of the major lessons that we learn in the science. Having insight creates instant buy-in. And he said, Jeff, you saved me tens of thousands of dollars. I asked him for a cut, but he said no. However, this is the benefit from an anecdotal perspective of how effective, some of the content can be when we actually act on it and use it on a regular basis.
Well, that's an amazing story, Jeff. And I have a son going to college, but he applied early to an expensive school and he got in. So I didn't really have a choice, but maybe I should have taken that BBC course earlier. And by the way, if people are interested, I can't promise that you'll save hundreds of thousands of dollars on college choices, but our BBC program, remember I was telling you earlier about where NLI started? That is where it all started. So if you're just interested in getting really deep into, how can I understand the brain, and how can I, as an individual having conversations, coaching people, et cetera, be more effective, then BBC, just go ahead and type BBC in. We've got our whole education team on here and they'll reach out to you, but it's a fantastic, I've been through it. We put all NLIers through that program, and it's fantastic and incredibly powerful. As Jeff says, not only pocketbook changing and bank account changing, but life changing for many people as well. Drew, anything else that you wanted to cover that we haven't had a chance to?
Yeah, thanks, Marshall. I'm seeing a question in the Q&A from Kristen Walsh around cognitive bias, and with hybrid workspaces becoming more prominent, do you have advice on people managers overcoming the bias to give growth opportunities to those in the office that they see regularly versus remote employees, right? So what you're describing right there, Kristen, is actually something we discuss in our Decide program. This is a distance bias. It could be expedience bias too, because we tend to make quick hit decisions, ones that will be immediately rewarding in some cases. But in this case, this is a distance bias. Our brain's proximity networks are, they over-index on closeness, whether it's in time, whether it's in space, whether it's in ownership, right? And in this case, what you're bringing up, a lot of organizations are struggling with this right now. Because yes, it is a lot easier. And we saw this before COVID, right? That it's easier. You might work with someone consistently that you're providing them with the growth opportunities. What you'd want to do is really understand the bias and look to mitigate that bias by looking at opportunities in which you might be able to distribute to those remote workplaces, right? Or to those remote team members. It's just, at the end of the day, it's about slowing down your decision-making process, right? Just evaluating your options, slowing down the process, and making a more informed decision.
Yeah.
Can I add to that, Drew? I would just say it's about really being deliberate. So what Seeds helps us to do is to recognize where these biases are showing up. And so when we describe distance bias to people and they understand what it means, it's non-conscious, right? You'd rather work with the people who you see every day right next to you in the office or in a cube or wherever they happen to be. So if you recognize, however, that the people who are attending virtually, who are working virtually, feel left out, they don't show up, they don't give their best energy and effort. And so therefore, we now, as leaders, we have to now consciously put into place habits, behaviors, processes that make sure that they are included and not left out. And so that's how we recommend, and we have people to brainstorm on many of these sessions to see what can we do as a group to make sure that we're not engaging distance bias at a non-conscious level.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, then there, like one of the habits I learned at NLI 4 years ago, because we've always been a virtual company, is, we have a rule where you always ask the people on video first for their input as opposed to people in the room. There's also some things you need to do in terms of systems, like making sure the audio is good so that I can hear every conversation. If I'm whispering to Drew over here next to me and Jeff's over remotely, so that he can hear and participate in that. There's a lot of things you need to do. In fact, we wrote an article. It's, as David Rock describes it, it seems like a terrible idea, but it's actually the right idea, which is like, if anyone's virtual, everyone should be virtual, because like it's fundamentally unfair for 4 people to be in a room and 1 person to not be in the room. Like, you have to work really hard to make that work. So one of the things that we've been talking to people is, how do you manage that? And we've had some people, I had the CEO of Humana decided he was never going to have a meeting with his executive team if they weren't either all in the room or they were all virtual, was not going to mix that up, because he sensed the unfairness and people weren't participating. So that was a rule or a habit that they created to improve their systems and make things more inclusive. And those are hard decisions for people to make right now. But fundamentally, if you, again, I guess we'll bring it back to where we started. Remember I said our vision is to make organizations more human through science. Sometimes science tells you to do things that seem really strange, but they actually work. And so a lot of times we have this concept at NLI, we talk about conventional wisdom versus research. A lot of times what we as human beings think is right is actually disproven by science. And so if you actually look at the research and you actually follow the research, you would build a very different organization that you have right now. And so what we encourage all of you to do, and I think we'll just wrap up now, is take a look at the research, take a look at the science. Yes, we've got great research. There are other organizations that get research, but if you follow the science, you will get to really novel, interesting solutions that will make your organizations more effective, make your people happier, make them more inclusive, make them more equitable, make people more engaged, and fundamentally achieve greater results. So I think it's been a great conversation. Thank you all for the participation in the chat. Drew and Jeff, thank you for all of your comments and feedback. Really enjoyed the time together. Hope everyone has a great Friday afternoon. It's sunny here in New Jersey, but a little cold. Hopefully it'll get warmer. Happy spring. And Evan, back to you.
Thanks, Marshall, and thank you, team, for the wonderful discussion. Before we head out today, I want to make sure that we are capturing all of the interest in some of the solutions and other items that we discussed today. So we've run a poll for you. If you could please go ahead and submit your answers to that poll, we'll be able to get in touch with you as soon as possible. In addition to the poll, we wanted to share a couple of quick announcements with you. But we'll pause while we share the poll for just a little bit longer. As you're submitting your interest, I just want to let everybody know that we are currently running a global research study on the state of hybrid work. So if you could please check out this URL right here, that's surveymonkey.com/r/hybrid-next, and submit your insights to that survey. It would be most appreciated. This will help our research team to come up with a point of view on what's really happening in the world of hybrid work. In addition, I want to remind everybody that the Neuroleadership Institute runs an insider program. Neuroleadership insiders are invited to exclusive webinars and are given upfront access to some of our newest innovations and research. You can apply at neuroleadership.com/insiders. Our next Insider Exchange event is set for May 18th, 2022 at 3 p.m. So we hope to see you there as you apply. In addition, we are hiring. We're looking for roles all around the globe. We have a work from almost anywhere policy here in the United States and are looking for a wide range of different competencies. So definitely have a look at neuroleadership.com/careers. We look forward to seeing your applications come in. And as well, in 2023, it may seem further away than you think, we will be bringing back the Neuroleadership Summit. So no summit in November of this year, but the year following. We hope to see you there. We're due to have it in New York City, but in practicing what we preach, we'll be offering a hybrid version of the conference in addition to the in-person gathering. If you were unable to visit, or if you were unable to attend the entirety of today's session, or you want to catch up on it on replay, we offer this Your Brain at Work live show in the form of a podcast. You can check out today's episode as well as past episodes with luminary leaders from organizations around the world at neuroleadership.com/podcast. And with that, I'll close out today's session. I thank you all so much for joining us today and look forward to your joining us next week. We'll be looking forward to seeing you as well as welcoming the wonderful Shelby Wilburn back to our session. So thank you so much and have a beautiful day. Take care.